Jim Michnowicz is an associate professor here at NC State of Spanish and Hispanic Linguistics. He completed his undergrad and master's degrees at The Ohio University in Spanish and Spanish Education. He taught Spanish at the University of Virginia's College at Watts before going back for his PhD at Penn State. And here at NC State, he directs the Corpus del Español de Raleigh-Durham, which is a collection of over 250 sociolinguistic interviews of North Carolina Spanish. And he also serves as the upper division coordinator for the Spanish program. So let's give him a hand.
Thank you guys, thanks for having me. So I'm going to steal one of the dean's jokes they told one time. And so, the definition of professor is someone that can talk for exactly 50 minutes about anything, right? So though some of you know, some of you have me in class, and at 6 o'clock I'm normally teaching a 3-hour seminar, so no promises. My 3-hour clock might kick in. Just go ahead and leave, it's fine, I'll just keep talking. So let me ask you a question. Do we want to do this full-on talk style? Do we want to do this interrupt with questions or comments class style? I'm good with either. So if you want clarification for something, stick your hand up and we'll just go with that, okay? So I'm here to talk to you a little bit tonight about what we know about Spanish in North Carolina, what we still need to find out, and what we're currently working on. Myself and a couple other faculty members and our graduate students in Hispanic Linguistics program, which is housed way over, I'm all turned around, way over in Withers Hall. Y'all should come see us sometime. Zach's there on Monday nights. And so just want to give you some insights into what we know about this nascent or newly forming bilingual community. So I also want to encourage this. So this is the Spanish Linguistics in North Carolina Conference, Slinky. You have to sort of play with the phonetics to make it work, but it does work. Otherwise it'd be Slink, and no one wants to go to a conference called Slink. This was founded here at NC State back in 2011. It's now in its, 7th year. And it moves around schools all around the state. So this is our first time at Wake Forest. The application deadline for abstracts is the 15th of this month, so it's coming up. But if you have something that is on Spanish, we'd love to have you submit. It'd be great. So it's a really student-friendly conference too, with posters and talks. It's one day, it's $25 and you get lunch, so it's a pretty good deal. You can just drive to Wake Forest. Okay, so what do I want to do today? I want to talk to you about, so what is going on with Spanish and English in North Carolina and the Southeast? I'm going to keep saying on this slide the Southeast, because we really do think that what is going on in North Carolina is representative of the Southeast, if you consider that to be, maybe parts of Virginia, maybe. South Carolina, definitely. Georgia, definitely. Right? Florida is its own beast. And some other areas in this part of the country. You may or may not be able to say very similar things about other new contact areas in the United States, such as parts of the Midwest. But since I don't work in the Midwest, I don't know. And we have a really good idea of what's going on in Chicago, but not a real good idea of what's going on in, say, Des Moines, right? And so there are some reasons to think it may be similar and may be different. Okay, we also want to look at how Spanish is changing as a result of this. So, in the English linguistics program, there's been a lot of work done on Latino English and how English changes in contact with Spanish, at least for those speakers. So we're looking at it from the Spanish point of view and what English contact or the contact environment does to the Spanish. And we're going to review some preliminary research that we have. Okay, and discuss our next steps. So I just want to go over these census data with you. So if you go back to 1980, right, some of you have seen this before. If you go back to 1980, what you find is the Hispanic population is very concentrated, right? So primarily in the Southwest, or the place where you didn't cross the border crossed you, right? Those are all areas that in the 1840s were part of Mexico. Southern Florida, which is primarily Cubans at the time, right? Areas around New York, primarily Puerto Ricans and Dominicans at the time. And Chicago, which was at the time primarily Mexicans there to work agriculture that moved to the city. There's now a really big, they call it Mexican community in Chicago, right? That it's one parent from Puerto Rico, one parent from Mexico. There's 5 families that showed up in Alaska, I think by accident, so I'm not sure what they were doing there. But if you notice,
Coast Guard.
That's entirely possible, yeah. If you notice, the entire rest of the country is pretty blank with regard to Hispanic population, right? Jump to 1990, not much has changed. What you essentially see is that you're starting to fill in some of the gaps here, right? So the Florida population is moving north. There's a huge Puerto Rican population in Orlando, for example. The New York metro area is spreading out, right, to New Jersey and some areas around Philly. And these gaps are filling in here, starting to fill in the Northwest. Got some Toledo, Ohio here. It's mostly agriculture popping in. But still, our entire part of the country is basically empty, right? Now jump to 2000, and you've now seen this purple explosion right here in North Carolina, centered in some of the agricultural counties for the most part. But you really see a huge change in that 10-year period, right? And if you go then to just 6 years later, which is the latest map I have for this, what you see is that the majority of North Carolina, some parts of South Carolina, and sort of a gap here in Georgia, but lots of Georgia's filling in with purple. So the Hispanic population is growing tremendously in this part of the country, and that puts Spanish and English into contact in a new area. And so the question is, so what, right? So what's so different about here versus other places? Well, what we think is going on in a second is that when Spanish English first came into contact in, well, Texas or California, we're talking in, depends on how you define those things, anywhere between the 1700s and the early 20th century. If you look at New York or Chicago, you're looking, the 40s, 50s, that sort of thing. Florida really happened in the after the Cuban Revolution in '59. Sociolinguistic methods, quantitative methods, portable recorders, Pratt, R, Excel, sociolinguistic theory did not exist at the time to be able to examine these new communities as they were forming. So we're able to see what they're like now. And in fact, most of the research on Spanish in the US is centered in sort of those four areas: Florida, New York, Chicago, or California, or the Southwest in general. So we feel that looking at Spanish in contact in these new areas allows us to see what happens at the very beginning, the very first moments of language contact, and that may reflect, or may not, but may reflect an earlier stage of, say, a more established area like Chicago or New York. It may not for a variety of reasons. There's no real reason to think they would act exactly the same. The real question becomes then, will North Carolina look like Florida or Chicago or New York in another 50 to 60 years? And there are reasons to think not actually, and we'll get to that in a moment. This is something a lot of people don't know. In number of speakers, the United States is the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. So we can stop talking about Spanish as being a foreign language, right? My own department, foreign languages and literatures, where Spanish is the largest one. Spanish does not need to be in that, under that title, right? We like where we are for other reasons. So there are more Spanish speakers in the United States than there are in Spain, okay? So that provides an interesting dynamic. With regard to North Carolina, we saw 111% growth during the 2000s of Hispanics. So, and most of those at that time were immigrants, so we can assume they spoke Spanish. If you look, I mean, you guys know where we are, but some of the point where Raleigh is, the people in other areas. But right there in Wake County, Wake is one of the areas that has seen the largest amount of growth, along with that's Mecklenburg, I think, right? And so it's interesting too because North Carolina presents, so what's the term that Walt Wolfram's used on numerous occasions in t-shirts, a dialect heaven, right? What we have here is a really nice mix of about 53% US born. So we're starting to see that generation 2 come in. Not all born in Raleigh, right? Lots of them born in other areas that have moved here. But we also rank 5th nationally in the amount of foreign-born immigrants. So we really see this combination of immigrants with what we call heritage speakers, or generation 2 or 3, well, we don't have 3 here yet, in this mix. And so, and if you look, this entire region, right, this is from Escobar and Potowski. So if you look right here, this is the percent of growth. And what you see is that with the exception of South Dakota, which is, I'm guessing, oil related in somehow, right? So people working in the shale fields. Essentially, the areas that have seen the most growth all exist in the broadly defined south or southeast. So this is an area that is really, really growing quickly. So this is the exact right time to be studying this. If you go back to those maps, if you went to study this in the 90s, nothing, the early 90s, there wouldn't have been anything to study, right? If you wait another 30, 40 years, you might miss it, right? If you blink, you might miss it kind of thing. And we'll talk about why that might be in a moment too. So in North Carolina, what's our population look like? It's about 800,000. So it's substantial. About 61% from Mexico, different parts of Mexico, mostly the center. And then a large chunk of Central Americans, mostly Salvadorans, Hondurans, a growing Guatemalan population, a good chunk of Puerto Ricans, and then you got a mixture of sort of the rest, but we do have a unique mix here. Most of the US is dominated by Mexicans, for obvious reasons. But then the mixture of Central American and Puerto Rican is also interesting compared to some areas that are dominated by particularly just one group. And so this is an activity, I don't know if you can see this. This is an activity we did it a couple of years at Fiesta del Pueblo. We go out and just like the English program goes to the state fair, we used to do the state fair too, and we realized that like 4 Spanish speakers passed by the entire time we were there for 11 days. So now we go to the Fiesta del Pueblo, and one of the activities we had was just, where are you from? Where's your family from, right? And what you can see is the people stuck pins in, and you can see that they're concentrated in central Mexico. A decent chunk in Colombia, if you can make that out. Puerto Rico is pretty full. Northern Central America is pretty full. There are like 3 people from Uruguay. They're the family of one of our grad students that stopped by. But it really gives you a sense of where people are coming from here, right? And so one of the real interesting things about this is that we do have that less established Hispanic population. So what does that do to the language contact situation? The idea is essentially that if you are from somewhere in Mexico and you move to LA, your life does not change drastically. You can plug right into a community that speaks primarily Spanish. Your exact same foods on every corner, same television shows, same everything. Your life is not that different. So you can plug into that community that has a critical mass of speakers, both native and, or monolingual, not monolingual, but native born and bilingual. Those terms become problematic sometimes. Whereas here, that's much more difficult to do. So I've lived in Raleigh since 2006. I don't know if anybody remembers 2006 in Raleigh, but it was hard to find good tacos, right? Now, and we're not just talking 10 years ago. And now, of course, good tacos are everywhere. And so it's sort of like the taco index, right? And so you sort of know that there's a legitimate population, legitimate presence when you start to see taco trucks with tacos de lengua, that's tongue, tacos de seso, which are brain tacos and that sort of thing. I recommend the tongue, not the brain. But that is also going to change the relationship that people have across languages, in the sense that it's not as easy in a place like Raleigh to just plug into a ready-made Latino community. We have very few Generation 3 speakers in Raleigh. In our corpus, it's now pushing almost 300 interviews. We don't have a single one. Now, it doesn't mean they're not there. Some of them are outside of IRB reach, right? So outside of blanket IRB reach, they're there, but they're not a lot of them yet. So we really are just coming into the Generation 2. Whereas if you go to a place like Chicago, you'll find Generation 3 and even Generation 4. The difference is the Generation 4 speakers don't speak Spanish anymore, right? And very few of the Generation 3 do. But as a point of comparison, we're at an earlier stage. So we're learning a lot about it. Most of the research looks at long-established populations or focuses on Latino English. There are some recent studies that I'm going to talk a little bit about here tonight. And again, we really want to observe how processes of contact, shift, and maintenance happen at those very early first stages of Spanish in this contact. Okay, so there are a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, Spanish in the US is complicated by at least 2 types of contact, right? You don't only have language contact with English, which is true. And something else someone was talked about a little bit today, not all Mexican immigrants or all Latino or Hispanic immigrants necessarily speak that good of Spanish. A lot of them are speakers of indigenous languages. And so you may find speakers that are dominant in the indigenous language, although that's becoming more and more rare in Mexico. But some of those speakers may actually skip Spanish altogether, right? So they don't pass from Zapoteco to Spanish to English. They pass from Zapoteco to straight to English, which is an interesting situation that we still don't know very much about. And again, what variety of English? So, there have been a lot of studies on this from an English point of view. So what type of English are they learning? How does that influence them? But also dialect contact, which is something that people often don't think about. If you live in a tiny pueblo in El Salvador, the chance of you running into a Puerto Rican or Dominican or Colombian or one of the 4 Uruguayans on any given day is really slim. Happens all the time here, right? And so you also have those processes of leveling and new dialect formation that can occur because of that don't occur in Spanish-speaking countries at the same speed. Okay, so what are we going to see? We're going to see the results from 2.5 studies. I'll explain the half studies in a minute. And then some informal surveys, this is the half, that we conduct at Fiesta del Pueblo and the Latino Arts Fest in Apex. And then legit survey data, more legit survey data, conducted by undergraduate students, I should say, by undergraduate students. And then the swarm, right? So I stole this term from Eric Thomas a few years ago because I loved it so much. In fact, I even changed my talk title right in the middle of the talk because I liked his title. The swarm, we're looking at 4 variables. Our swarm is small but growing with the same speakers, and that's data from the corpus. So when we go to places like Fiesta del Pueblo, we conduct some just, as you all do at the fair, right? We conduct some just sort of informal research. So one of the questions we were curious about is what adjectives do people use to describe themselves in North Carolina. And so there are other areas of the country where speakers have a very clear preference. So for example, in New Mexico, 88% identified as Hispano and only 18% as Latino, right? And these terms, different areas mean different things. Hispanic in general implies a language connection. So Spaniards would be Hispanic, but Brazilians would not. Latino implies a Latin American connection. So Spaniards are not Latino, but Brazilians are, right? Again, you ask 50 people, you're going to get 40 different definitions of these. But what we found we just didn't know, we wanted to know. What we found in North Carolina is that no, it doesn't matter. It does not matter yet. And we think that has to do with the youngness, that's the word I'm looking for, of the contact situation. You've got people from a lot of different parts of the country. And this idea of how you express your identity as a Hispanic American or Latino American hasn't become an issue yet, right? And in fact, we also had a decent number of people that just came out and said, I say Mexicano, or I say Puerto Riqueño, or whatever it might be. So that's one difference between here and other areas. And 31% chose more than one. This is something we did this past year. In your opinion, how important is it to, how important is speaking Spanish to Latin identity or Latino identity in the United States? And most people said extremely important. That's different from more established regions, right? So California, only 30% said that in that previous study. Adolescent Mexican Americans in, I forget where this is, I think it's in California. Spanish was not strongly correlated with identity. In Chicago, Spanish is important but not necessary. And that makes sense if you think about it. Those communities that have a lot of G2 or G3 or even G4 speakers, so you consider yourself to be Latino or Hispano, but your Spanish is pretty weak. So therefore, for you to continue to identify with that identity, you can't make language an important part of it. Here, that's not a problem yet, in the sense that most of the people that we're dealing with are either Spanish dominant or are fairly balanced bilingual to some extent. But Spanish is still very much alive in both of the generations of the community we're seeing, although it's changing. This was an interesting question. What is the importance of languages? So what languages are important for your children in the United States, or for Hispanic children? So blue is both languages, both Spanish and English are equally important, right? That's the overwhelming answer. And essentially it comes down to English tends to have an instrumental function. So English is what gets you a job and what helps you integrate. Spanish is effective. Spanish is what allows you to continue to communicate with your grandparents and your family. We do have red, which is 12%, which is more than I thought it would be. English is more important than Spanish. And there are people that came right out and said Spanish is a dead end. That's part of one of the myths that we're trying to break down. Slowly, I don't know about Shirley yet, but we're slowly working on ways to sort of get the word out that that's not necessarily true. And then 4% said Spanish is more important. Interestingly enough, the comments on that 4% all sounded something like this. Spanish is more important because they're going to learn English anyway. So what people are reinforcing the fact that we need to maintain Spanish because English will take care of itself, which is something that we're also trying to get across to the Anglo community, that we can stop freaking out about English disappearing in the United States. Ain't gonna happen. So, okay, so just some informal stuff. Now, so some of the surveys we did, this was based on Van Hert et al.'s survey of Newfoundland and Labrador. So if you guys have read this study ever, it's pretty cool. It's part of the study is how to conduct research in big undergraduate classes and actually have it say something. So we took his survey, he gave it to us very generously, and we adapted it to Spanish here. We did about 500 of them. This occurred over a couple of classes, and it provided the data for students then to work on. Several of them went on to graduate school. One of them is currently on doing a PhD, so it worked. But we also got some cool data. We had 3 sections. We looked at language use in North Carolina, pronouns of address. Basically, that's tu or usted or vos, right? So, or tu or vous, like in a French setting. That told us absolutely nothing. But we needed an extra variable for the students to study. But then loan words, which is sort of what I'm going to focus on here. And so for the loan words, what we asked them, following Van Hert, was so lonche to indicate the meal in the middle of the day, instead of like almuerzo, right, or comida. And then you put, I say it, yes or no. And then you put how often you hear it in North Carolina. So never, rarely, sometimes, many times, all the time. And then you could put down who says it, right? So that was an interesting comment as well. So first of all, let's look at language use. This is really, really interesting. So what we have here, if you can make it out, older, middle-aged, younger, English, Spanish, both equally. Okay, so we asked people to self-report this across, the survey is very short. It has to be, it's done in like 5 to 10 minutes. So we asked them across 4 or 5 contexts, just what you use at work, what you use with your friends, what you use with your family, what do you use when watching TV or movies, right? And essentially that was it. So it's limited, but it's very interesting. So if we look over here at the older speakers, this is cool. What we find is that their reported use of English, whether they are heritage speakers, they're born here blue, or immigrant speakers, red, is identical. It doesn't seem to matter for that older generation, right? Their use of English is limited. What you see then is, of course, that as to be expected for Spanish, the immigrants report more Spanish than do heritage speakers, but the difference is not immense. What you see, where you see the biggest difference is both equally. So we see that with almost the same, actually the exact same amount, heritage speakers are reporting either a Spanish use or a bilingual use more than English, so among those older speakers. Whereas the immigrants report much less equal use. It makes sense. If you're born here, your English is going to be stronger, right? If we look at the middle generation, what we find is sort of a mirror image here. So first of all, English, heritage speakers have taken off, right? So these are people between about age 30 and 50. So for those speakers, English is the dominant form in all of those contexts. Of course, family tends to favor Spanish a little more than some other do. If we look then at Spanish, we see the exact opposite, right? We see very low for heritage, Spanish only, very high for immigrant speakers. And both equally, we see again the heritage are ahead, but we see that difference is starting to shrink somewhat compared to the other. Now if you look at younger, younger is actually almost a mirror image of older, right? So what you see now is that English dominates for everyone. This is interesting. Even if you were born in another country, you are converging with English at the same rate that heritage speakers are, right? Which you would assume most of which are English dominant. Spanish, for heritage speakers, has dropped off to 18%, Spanish only. But what you see though is that the bilingual use is now, again, exactly tied as it was for English with the older. So we see this move both away from Spanish and away, or the bilingual norm is actually fairly stable. But what you see is this convergence where your generation doesn't matter so much anymore among younger speakers. So they're learning English, right? So again, English is not the problem. The problem is getting them to preserve that Spanish. There we go. Okay, so the other part of the survey, we looked at loan words. And so we looked at 10, 12 loan words that we pulled from the literature, from things we had heard, questions we had. We could have, if we put 10 different loan words up here, we get slightly different results. But essentially what we see is that these loan words, so we have aplicación instead of solicitud, right? So what happens is these are words that overlap semantically about 80% between Spanish and English. So application, aplicación, both apply to the application of a theory. That's the same word in both languages. The application of paint, that's the same theory, that's the same word. Where it differs is a job application. So in standard Spanish, it would be solicitud, right? To solicit something, right? Parquear instead of estacionar, to park your car. We have lonche instead of almuerzo or comida. We have troca instead of, yeah, it's a truck, camioneta, right? So like a pickup truck. Carpeta, so carpeta in standard Spanish is a folder, right? Like you put your papers in. Here, of course, it means carpet, right? It means alfombra. Yarda is exactly what it sounds like. It's the green space around your house, right? Instead of jardín or patio or césped or pasto. Atender, this is another one very much like aplicación. Atender overlaps about 80% with the English use. So the nurse attends to the patient. That's the exact use this happens that occurs in Spanish. What doesn't occur is you don't atender a party. Right. Or you asistir. Right, you asistir. So that's where that's coming across. Te llamo para atrás. So this is a really interesting one that I'll come back to in just a moment. So it means I'll call you back. Huachale, which if you've seen the videos is fairly famous and widely ridiculed and hated by most people in the survey, and then marqueta instead of market, like supermarket, okay? So what we have here is we have these two words that enjoy wide-ranging acceptance. And so again, this survey, we know on surveys, people don't always put down what they actually do. They put down what they think they do or what they think is okay, right? But no one has a problem with these words, essentially. And part of that is aplicación is a word that you now hear in Mexico. So it has filtered down from the border area into the rest of Mexico. And part of that is simply websites,
Yes.
Media, cell phones, that sort of thing, exactly right. So all of that kind of thing, right? Sort of just breaks down that little 20% difference. Turns a false friend into a true friend, right? Parquear is a word that you don't hear a ton, for example, in all parts of the Spanish-speaking word, but what you do hear is, so for example, a parking lot in Spain is un parking, right? And so there are these, parqueadero, there are these terms that have park in them that maybe sort of soften that word up as well. Okay, so those are widely accepted. The words in the middle all hover around 40-50%. Lonche, troca, carpeta, and yarda, we think are fairly job specific, right? So if you work construction or landscaping or some of those manual jobs, you're gonna get in the troca in the morning, you're gonna go install la carpeta, you're gonna go out and mow the yarda. And so we believe it's a way, I mean, they're sort of natural loan words, right? But also it is a way to mark yourself as an in-the-know member of the community that's been here for a while. So if you just show up from Mexico and you walk up and say, where's the camioneta? Que we have to go mow the césped? They're going to say, new guy, right? And so this is a way to quickly adopt those and point out that you're from here. Atender is different, and atender, we can talk about that later, but it seems like it's about a generation behind aplicación, but among youngest speakers it's quite a bit higher than that. Lonche is an interesting case. You will hear lonche in Mexico from time to time. They use lonchar now, but and they always laugh after they say it, right? So it's sort of like they know it's an Anglicism. There's some studies that argue that it's a semantic difference. So if you've ever been in the Spanish-speaking world, what happens is lunch is the big meal of the day, right? So schools close, businesses used to close, they don't close anymore, but schools close, all the kids go home for lunch. You've got about 2 or 3, 4 hours there where there are no classes, where not a lot's happening. It depends on the part of the world. But so that is sort of the big meal of the day. Their dinner, which happens between 9 and 12 o'clock at night, depending on the country, looks a whole lot like our lunch, right? So for example, in Mexico, you don't eat tacos for lunch, because tacos are dinner food. Because just like you probably wouldn't eat like a bologna sandwich for dinner. Well, students, right? But the same, you wouldn't go home to your mom's house and have bologna sandwiches, right? And so there are speakers, not all of them, but there do appear to be speakers that distinguish lonche is the 10-minute break you get during the work week to cram your sandwich down while you're waiting for work. Whereas comida or almuerzo is what you go home and eat with your families on Sunday, right? So not all speakers make that distinction, but some appear to. Te llamo para atrás is cool. So literally means, so this is a correct pronoun, right? So I'll call you for back, right? So in standard Spanish, this would be something like te vuelvo la llamada. So I will return your call. Te devuelvo la llamada. Te vuelvo a llamar. Some idea of volver, to return, right? So a lot of people think this is a straight up calc, right? It's a translation from English. This particular term drives native Spanish speakers in other countries nuts when they hear it, which just kind of makes me laugh actually. But Ricardo Otegi in a paper argues that it's not actually a calc at all. What it is a conceptual convergence. So if you look at it, the grammar of this is actually quite Spanish, right? You have a prepositional phrase headed here. If you change llamo with I push, so I'll push you back, te empujo para atrás, that's perfectly good Spanish, right? I'm going to move this chair back, ¿verdad? La muevo para atrás. Perfectly good Spanish, right? So what has happened here, and if you imagine, I'll call you back. A literal translation from Spanish would be something like llamaré, so I will call, you, te, back, atrás. So there's no preposition, the clitic's in the wrong place, right? So what happens here is, instead of a grammatical or syntactic translation, what we have is a translation of the idea of back rather than return, right? So that's an interesting idea, where you have the convergence between different concepts in English and Spanish. The grammar, however, remains completely Spanish. These last two words, nobody likes them. And guachale, we have a funny story here. A few years back at the fair, we tried to give out guachale buttons, and we couldn't give the things away, except to older, non-Hispanic men, often, but women, so people who would come up and say, "Oh, guachale, my grandma used to say that." No, she didn't, because it's Spanglish, right, or it's whatever. So it's the English verb watch with a Spanish verbal ending, a. And then this ley is called Mexican intensifying ley. And so in Mexican Spanish in particular, you get ley on lots of words that intensifies them. So you've probably heard of like andale, right? Dale, correle, pásele, right? So in Spain, in Spain or Argentina or Puerto Rico, when they say, hey, go, you go first, they would just say, no, pase. In Mexico, it becomes pásele, right? So this is recognized as an Anglicism everywhere. It does occur in some areas of northern Mexico, and it sort of means either to watch out, so guáchale, so ten cuidado, or it can mean, without the ley, it can mean like, hey, watch this on TV, oye, watcha esto, right? What we're going to see is that very specific subgroups use that. And then marqueta, the comments we got on that were, just sounds weird, we don't use that here. So it's a common word in parts of California, they just don't happen to use it here. But really no sort of negative reactions towards it. So, something interesting with guachale, well, we'll see some of those comments in just a moment. Okay, so what we find is that young speakers are, in fact, leading this process of loanword adoption, but not for all loanwords. So if we just look at aplicación, which is sort of our highest rated one, what we see here is that even older speakers, here in the green, use quite a bit, but it really took off between that and the middle generation, right? If you look at atender, you can see that it's a generation behind, right? So if you imagine that this is going to be the new middle generation, the next one should bump that up quite a bit. If you look at guachale, it's completely flat, right? So guachale is essentially accepted by, I'm not saying that people don't use it, accepted by Mexican men with lower levels of education, right? So it seems to identify those groups as well, right? So guachale identifies you as a particular type of Spanish speaker in the United States. Which I think, here's the guachale button, that I think there's still some floating around because Spanish speakers won't touch them with a 10-foot pole. They won't touch the hablo español North Carolinense either, so I speak North Carolina Spanish. We debated forever how to say North Carolinian in Spanish, and what we got told was, it didn't offend anybody, but what we got told was, no, I speak Mexican Spanish, you speak North Carolina Spanish. So we settled on hablamos español and NC, and that one, people like that button. But if you look at aplicación, the comments we got were mostly positive. So one person wrote, I say it because it's the word you're supposed to use. Like, don't even recognize another word for that, right? Whereas guachale, the comments we get are gente naca, so it's like hillbillies, but with a more negative hillbilly than hillbilly, right? Naco, being called a naco is not a good thing. Gang members use it. Low socioeconomic level people say, poor people say that. Some people know it's an exaggeration of Mexican-American identity, or like this one, tremendo Spanglish, right? So the idea is that it's just mixture, and so people really seem to reject these obvious mixtures. One of the reasons we wanted to focus on that in this study was that in Spanish-speaking fields, so if you talk to professors or teachers or academics, or even just people on the street, many Hispanics, or in Hispanic culture, they seem to be more in tune with language than many English speakers, at least many Americans are. So we all know that language is an important part of your identity, where you're from. But I've never had a taxi driver in the US start to talk to me about where the best English is spoken, or why this poem is better than that poem, right? This idea of very awareness of linguistic differences happens there. And so what you'll see in opinion columns in newspapers in Spain primarily, but some other countries, is how bad Spanish in the US is, right? How it's this corruption, how you can't even understand it, how it's its own sort of language. And some people have taken that and run with it. So there's Ilan Stavans is a professor, a Mexican-American professor somewhere in New England now, who plays with this idea, and as an artist I completely respect his ability to do that. But he wrote, for example, the first chapter of Don Quixote in Spanglish, but it's unreadable. No bilingual Spanish speaker would ever speak this way, because he's using the language as an artistic means. But what happens is people read that and go, wow, if we don't do something about this problem, we're not going to understand each other in 100 years. And it's completely ridiculous, right? There are just as many differences between Mexico and Spain as there are between Spain and the United States with regard to the Spanish spoken. So what we want to point out is many of those words that really set people off, like guachale, actually are not that common and don't seem to be expanding at all across age groups or across generations. So many of the Spanglish terms, and we can talk about why we don't like that term later if you want, but many of these loan words, most speakers don't even know they're loan words. Words like aplicación, right? So I think we can just all relax about the future of Spanish in the United States with regard to being some horrible corruption of Spanish. It's all just bad Latin anyway. Okay, so with the 5-10 minutes, probably 10 minutes I have left, I want to look at the swarm very quick, and this is where it's going to get super linguistic-y for a minute. But yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. So swarming is when you analyze multiple variables for a group of speakers. And I'm just going to throw up a quote from Thomas here. Even if one variable shows noteworthy patterns that provide clues about the social identities of speakers, it cannot provide a complete picture of the intersecting identities that individuals exhibit. Each linguistic variable may reveal new social meanings and patterning. What we need is an inquiry that compares a large number of diverse variables. Now, Thomas in this study has like 42 variables or something crazy like that he analyzes with the same speakers. We're at 4. We're working on like 8. So we're picking up steam here. But it's interesting that the results we find. So we look at 4 things that vary across dialects and also across English and Spanish. So we look at vowels. We know that Spanish has 5 vowels and not a whole lot of interest going on there. More than we thought, but compared to English, vowels aren't diagnostic for dialect for any Spanish speaker. It's consonants that are diagnostic. English, of course, is a mess. Realization of intervocalic badaga. So Spanish has approximate, so you say cada en todo for TODO, todo. English only has occlusives, right, of this, so badaga. We look at rhythm with NPVI. Spanish is a prototypical syllable time language. All the syllables are about the same length, in theory. English is stress timed. Stressed syllables are long, unstressed syllables are schwa, right? So English syllables are doing this, Spanish syllables are doing this. Some people describe English or Spanish as a machine gun, whereas English would be like a galloping horse, right? That badum, badum, badum kind of thing. And we look at discourse markers, so whether people use English or Spanish discourse markers like so or entonces, that sort of thing. Okay, so yeah, we have interviews, and we align them using Eric Wilbank's wonderful force alignment system, right? So we know what that does, and if you don't, we can talk about it. So we looked at all this stuff. Okay. Okay, we know about vowels. Okay, so vowel space tends to be smaller for L2 speakers, some studies have found, in comparison to monolinguals. So, and the idea has to do with how peripheral your vowels are and how, whether or not some of your vowels are reducing. And so that leads us to what we analyzed. Okay, so we looked at F1, F2, and F3. We measured the vowels, right? We normalized them. Then we looked at the convex hull area, which is, if you think about the vowel triangle, which in English is kind of this odd shape, and in Spanish is actually pretty triangular. If you think about that as being sort of the perimeter of your house, like how long around it is, what we're studying with the convex hull is the square footage, right? So we're looking at how big this entire space is. Okay, so bigger or smaller. We have a total of 126,000 vowels that we're looking at. So what we see here, the heritage speakers are in black, the immigrant speakers are in gray. Very few differences. U is fronted among heritage speakers. If you know anything about English vowels, you might know why that might be, right? English U is fairly fronted compared to Spanish U. This is a common finding and found in pretty much every study of heritage Spanish. What we find, though, is that the black line, for the most part, there's a little difference with A, is essentially within the gray line, right? So the space in general is smaller. The vowels are more centralized. I don't know if that's a term I want. Less peripheral. And if you look at the convex hull area, what you find is that, yes, the immigrant speakers have a larger vowel space, it's higher up, and the heritage speakers have a lot more variation in their vowels, which is to be expected. These are bilingual speakers. You're getting a lot of variation. But do we have any major significant differences? No. Kind of disappointing, right? Hang on. So let's look at badaga. So essentially, Spanish alternates badaga with wadaga. And I always have to say this for English folks. So for many of you all, that middle symbol, for example, might look like a the, right? For Spanish, it's not. It is the approximate version of da. In theory, they should have a little diacritic underneath them that show they're approximate. But because in Spanish, everyone knows that, we just skip the diacritic. These are wa, and right? So like agua instead of agua. And so what we find is that, for the most part, you're going to get approximate realizations in Spanish, except for some very particular positions. And it does depend a little bit on dialect. English, of course, only has occlusive. So if there's English influence, what we might find is more occlusive badaga in the Spanish of bilinguals. And so what we measured here was the intensity difference. If you have questions about this, we can do it. It's a widely used method. We essentially take the intensity of the consonant and subtract it from the maximum intensity of the vowel to get how different they are. So this D is fairly vowel-like, as you can see from the formant structure. This D is much more consonantal, right? So it gives us a range to look at there. Again, a larger difference should be more occlusive-like, maybe more English influenced, okay? Maybe. 16,000 tokens. What do we find? That is generation, that is region. No significant effects whatsoever. Why are we doing this? You should see the grad students freak out when their thesis data has no significant effects whatsoever. You guys just wait. Sarah's well familiar with that. What we do see, though, is a difference among country of origin. So what we see is that the Central American heritage speakers actually produce more occlusive-like variants than do the immigrants, whereas the Mexican heritage speakers are the opposite, right? So they are producing more alighted, approximate, softer badagas. And so we talk about why that might be in just a moment. Okay, rhythmic timing. Many of you are probably familiar with PVI. What it does is it compares adjacent pairs of vowels. And if they're more alike in duration, then you have a more Spanish-like system. If there are larger differences in those vowel lengths, then it's a more English-like system, right? So higher values are going to mean more English-like. We do PVI, right? So what you do is you go through and you carefully measure every single one of the consonant and vowel boundaries. If you've ever done this by hand, it's horrible. I highly recommend getting yourself an aligner. And then once you align it, we did go in and manually adjust them all. But it took us about 3 weeks instead of about 7 months to do the equivalent by hand. So definitely do that, 59,000 comparisons. And there's absolutely nothing going on. Nothing at all. But if we look at individual values, these are heritage speakers on the left. These are immigrant speakers on the right. Well, the first thing you can notice is that the immigrant speakers are much more concentrated, right? In fact, they're almost linear right along this, 55, 57, 60 line. I do have to note, those are all pretty high PVI values for Spanish. Some papers by Carter, other people report values in the 20s or 30s. That's super, 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 like when I put on my very best phonetics professor voice, I was able to maintain a PVI of about 25 or 30 for about 30 seconds. That is extremely syllable timed. What we notice, though, is that the heritage speakers are much more variant in their productions to the left, right? There's a whole big range there. And if we look at the 7 speakers, right, that have PVIs above 60, this is English range, 5 of them are heritage speakers. Right? So it appears there may be something going on, even though we don't have any significant differences yet. Okay, who wants a significant difference? It's coming your way right now. This is English discourse markers. So we're looking at whether or not speakers said so or entonces, or pues or well, right? That's the variable. Is it in English or is it in Spanish, these discourse markers? Because you can't tell where a discourse marker doesn't appear, right? Well, you can, but you don't know why they didn't put it there. So to give you an idea, studies in a lot of areas show that this can be an indicator of acculturation. More English discourse markers imply more acculturation, more linguistic adaptation. Makes sense. And in many areas like Chicago, both G1 and G2 speakers incorporate these to a very large degree, right from the start. So for example, 60% so in Chicago, among immigrants, and 85% so in New Mexican Spanish, right? So these are high numbers. So these are the pairs we're looking at, right? So significant difference, fire me, right? 29% English DMs for heritage speakers, kind of ugly graph. 1% English DMs for immigrant speakers. The immigrants just aren't using them, which is weird because they are in other areas, right? And I think that has to do with what we talked about before, where we don't have the critical mass of speakers yet in order for this to happen. So if you compare these, this is Chicago, this is Torres and Petoskey, versus Raleigh. Again, we don't have G3 in Raleigh yet. What you see though is that G1 in Chicago behaves a lot like G2 in Raleigh, at least for some of those speakers. Now what's going on with Central American versus Mexican? We have some theories. So, and this idea of critical mass becomes important. Because it's not enough to put two languages in the same geographic space in order to have mutual influence, with the exception of vocabulary, right? So if I go to the taqueria for the first time, I don't speak a word of Spanish, they don't speak any English, and I'm pointing and they're like, oh, a taco, right? So I now have the word taco in my language anglicized, right? But let's assume that I speak only Spanish, Jessica speaks only English. We can't influence each other's speech at a phonological and morphological or syntactic level, right? Because we don't understand the word we're saying. So what you need is bilingual speakers, right? Where the language is in contact in their brains, then form a community of bilingual speakers where these bilingual norms can be passed on. What we think is going on is that plug-in. You can immigrate to Chicago and plug right into a bilingual community where you're hearing so automatically. And it's contagious. It's very, very easy to pick up. In Raleigh, you're not plugging into that bilingual community yet. You're plugging into either an English-speaking community or an essentially Spanish, highly dominant, almost monolingual community, right? So we don't have that critical mass of bilinguals yet. So they kind of behave the same, right? Hardly any differences. It's kind of disappointing. But when we look at individual speakers, what we see are some interesting trends. So what we did here was we have the four variables, so discourse markers, PVI, which is rhythm, Badaga, occlusive versus approximate, and then the vowel space, how big the vowel space was. And what we did was we looked at the individual speaker coefficients produced by the statistical model. And so these coefficients are positive if the speaker favors a certain variant, negative if the speaker statistically disfavors a certain variant. And if they favored the contact variant, we gave them a check. Okay? So that's how we did this. So we didn't have to sort of come up with any cutoff. The statistics did it for us. What we notice is the four speakers that have all four favoring contact variants, every single one of them is a heritage speaker. Nicely, 2 from Mexico, 2 from Central America. So it seems that heritage speakers, even though as a community are not different, some heritage speakers are beginning to form these bilingual norms of the type that we expect to find in places like New York, Chicago, and California, right? There's a ton of variation in the middle, but if we look at the bottom, of the bottom 6 speakers that show none of the patterns, 4 of them are immigrants, right? So again, you've got a wide range of heritage speakers. Some are conservative, some are innovative. But the most innovative people in the community are all heritage speakers. So we think these are the first signs of this bilingual community forming. And what's important is, if we didn't swarm this, we wouldn't know. If you only did Badaga, you'd say, well, that was a waste of 6 months of my life. And let's move on. I mean, a null result's a result, but nobody wants to publish a paper about nothing, right? No one wants to print a paper about nothing. So that ability is what enabled us to sort of uncover these patterns in the community. So I just want to close with this. We think this allows us to have something to say about the order of integration of contact effects. There's a lot of theory about this, but we think we find proof for it, some support for it in this. So clearly, lexical variables are the first thing that come over, right? No one doubts that, especially cultural loans or work-specific, that sort of thing. But then we see DMs are the first thing that come in after that, right? There's discourse markers. There's a significant difference of generation. There's debate over whether discourse markers are code switches, are they loan words, are they their own thing? They sort of seem to be their own thing, maybe. But then after this, what we see is that prosody seems to follow next. There's a lot of research that prosody is acquired very early. It's rhythm, right? Accent is acquired very, very early in childhood, maybe even in utero, right? So there are a lot of studies that babies in the womb can recognize the rhythm of their native language and they don't respond to the rhythm of their non-native language, or even the rhythm of their native dialect. More than half of our speakers show, statistically, an English-type rhythm. A more English-type rhythm, I should say that. As you change your prosody, that is going to produce changes in vowels, right? In your vowel duration in particular, and your vowel quality as well. So a stress-timed rhythm from English is going to feed vowel reduction. It's going to make your unstressed vowels get shorter, and you're going to shrink your vowel space. This then feedback loops into rhythm. That also continues to change your rhythm, which continues to change your vowels, right? So that is a snowball that begins to happen quite quickly. And then you have these other phonological variables, in our case BDG, where there's not a whole lot going on, and that seems to require a much larger level, if that's what I want, larger critical mass of bilingual speakers in order to affect those levels of the language. So that's where we are right now. I mean, we have some theories about Badaga. We can talk about those. But essentially, there's that question again. Will North Carolina be similar to New York? Is it similar to New York and Chicago 50 years ago? Some signs point to yes. Some signs point to no, in the sense it is a very different dynamic. So why would it be the same to those dialects? But at the same time, will it look like New York or Chicago in another 50 years? There are positive signs. We know a whole lot more about bilingualism now than we used to. So some of us went and met with the Mexican consulate today to talk about ways to preserve Spanish among those G2 speakers, right? Heritage speakers essentially don't want to speak Spanish because if you're an adolescent, what's the one thing you don't want to be? It's different, right? Mm-hmm. So speaking Spanish marks you out as different. It's a very slow process, but we're trying to figure this out. But it really is a question of critical mass. If immigration stopped tomorrow, native Spanish would disappear within 100 years in North Carolina, right? Because it's not being passed on to the next generations in the way it is in some of those other areas. But it's not that it's being passed on to a large extent in those areas either. So when I teach classes sometimes on subject pronoun realization, this is Spanish is pro-drop, you don't have to say the subject, right? And so whether or not you say hablo or yo hablo is different pragmatically, but not different referentially, right? So it means the same thing. So what happens is that your pronoun rate tends to go up. English is like, what, 95 some percent, right? Something like that, except for very particular contexts. Spanish is around 20%, 20 to 30, depending on the dialect. Those numbers tend to go up when you're in contact with other languages. It doesn't seem to matter what language you're in contact with. Bilingualism alone seems to bump that pronoun rate. Studies of Spanish-Italian bilinguals, their pronoun rate goes up. They should be identical, but their pronoun rate goes up because essentially you're not paying attention to the pragmatics anymore. You simplify your pragmatics. But so I got a question one time, so will we eventually get to a point where in generation 4 or 5, those speakers will have Spanish with 100% pronouns? And I said, well, they will have 100% pronouns, but it's not Spanish. It's because they're going to speak English, right? And so part of that drive is to understand what's happening while it's still happening, while at the same time trying to keep it in place as an economic, social, cognitive, cultural identity benefit for those Latinos that are moving to North Carolina or born in North Carolina in the future. Mm-hmm. So those are our conclusions. The swarm is going. We are growing the swarm. We got students working on it now. You want to come work on the swarm and you speak Spanish, let me know. We will swarm you up. It does feel like that sometimes. So, thanks everybody. A little over a bit. We have time for a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is just so interesting. I think I have one question that is related to the kind of communities we're talking about. So are we talking about very dense social networks? Do we have some information about these communities?
Okay, so there are two answers to that question. One is we do not have that information about our data set. So I heard someone at a conference say one time that you can either have a very small amount of super clean data or a very large amount of really dirty data, right? And so that's why I'm a sociolinguist, because clean data doesn't interest me that much. So no, most of these interviews were conducted by students in our classes, and so each interview may have been conducted by a different person. So it gives us a really wide swath. It also means that by including speaker in the statistical model, we automatically control for interviewer effects, because there's only one interviewer per interview, so that's kind of nice. The downside is we don't know about those social networks, and my suspicion is My suspicion is that these speakers that are, where are they? These speakers that are leaders have wider social networks than the very conservative speakers down here.
Yeah.
That's my suspicion. What we need to do is, go old school on this and block off, a square mile and call up every house and see if they'll give
Because I
to
was
us.
also wondering if that might play into the way some loan words, especially those related to work,
Absolutely,
might make more sense if
absolutely,
related with the social class or the main
Exactly.
occupation of those.
absolutely. No, 100%. Yes. We don't know that completely. We do know for the surveys, we do know people's education levels. Anytime you collect data from a university with university students or faculty, the problem is you're always going to skew your data towards university educated people. And so because it's
Yeah.
because people that aren't university educated are harder to get in touch with, or they're at work, right? So they don't have the freedom to sort of just take off for an hour during the day to talk to you. So that's something we need to do, but I absolutely expect to find that. Yes, I believe this is highly correlated with social network. Absolutely.
So just out of curiosity, have you thought about the impact of like all the Venezuelans, all the Puerto Ricans, all the Mexicans that are fleeing because of all of these natural disasters
right.
these days? And are you or are your classes
Okay.
connected with people who are arriving, like now?
So no, we do not have immediate plug-ins with people that are sort of arriving right now. So we've sort of cast a real wide net and we sort of catch what we catch, so to speak. That's a really interesting question. And I think it's going to be important to look at those communities. We do have a student working on Puerto Rican data right now. And of course,
Do you?
Puerto Rico is different from other areas in the sense that they're citizens.
Right.
Even though no one in this country seems to know that. But what that means though is that Puerto Ricans can freely come and go.
Yes.
In a way that say Mexicans cannot, right?
Exactly.
And that is in essence, that is the method you just talked about is how Cuban Spanish has been studied for the last 40 years because Cuba was off limits. And Latin America itself is just now starting to embrace sort of sociolinguistic methods in theory. They're very sort of entrenched in old school dialectology. And so Cuban Spanish was essentially, there were literally people that are like, as you get off the boat, can I interview you? Because I want to know what Cuban Spanish is like. And some studies that look at people that came before and after the revolution. So no, we haven't looked at that yet, but I think that would be fascinating.
Well, and part of why I'm asking, right, is like I moved to Raleigh a few months ago from Puerto Rico.
Okay.
Right, I've been there for the past 10 years. My
Yeah.
family is still there. We're
Okay.
trying to,
Yeah.
still get them out.
Are they okay?
Still no power.
Well, that's what my friends in Puerto Rico, the answer is estamos vivos, right? So we're alive, we're not okay. Yeah.
Right, and
Yeah.
and that's par for the course right
Right,
now. I could say they're better off than a lot of people,
Right.
thankfully.
Right.
But I was at an event this past weekend, which was specifically set up with a lot of different service
Yeah.
groups, specifically to work with those who are coming in.
Yeah.
The new Venezuelans, the new
Yeah.
Puerto Ricans,
Yeah.
and so if those are connections, that I can help you to even make.
Thank you.
I would be very happy
We
to
should get
do
in touch.
that.
Yeah, definitely. We'll talk right after. Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
The Spanish in New York and like Chicago and California, it's been evolving for like exponentially longer than the one in North Carolina.
Correct.
And according to this data, like the Spanish in North Carolina will eventually reach that level like in about 50 years, right?
That's one possible hypothesis. My suspicion is no. My suspicion is that unless something changes, and so you can always have a fork in the road, take it, right? So unless something in the trajectory changes, I don't think that we're going to reach the level of critical mass of bilingual speakers. I don't think Raleigh's going to look like Chicago in 50 years. I don't. I would like it to, not only for selfish reasons, that I really, really, really want to know what Generation 5 Spanish is like. It just doesn't exist, right? I would really like to know what that's like. but also there's a real weird, what we're seeing in North Carolina is, and we don't have all the data on this yet, but there are suggestions, even from that little 500 person survey we did, there are suggestions that people are transitioning to English here faster than they do in California or New York.
Yeah,
Because you have to.
you have to.
Because you have to. And there are also, there are all sorts of issues with that. We were talking about some of that this afternoon. There was part of the problem is, just the dominance of English, right? Part of the problem is that a lot of Hispanic families view Spanish as a barrier to their kids' success. So again, this idea that not only should they speak English, which they do, but that they should only speak English, and that somehow speaking Spanish is a barrier. Now that's very social class differentiated. So if you're a doctor from Bogota, your view is different than if you're a landscaper from somewhere else, from a small town. So it's an uphill battle to sort of get in and change those perceptions about Spanish and about how it's useful. So the discrepancy is, I have 2 kids in the school system in Wake County. And so my daughter, she's in a magnet school, is able to take Spanish as an elective, or if we had chosen a different magnet school, could be educated half the day in Spanish, like bilingual education. The Spanish-speaking kids in her kindergarten class were not allowed to be taught in Spanish, right? So they were pulled out for ESL a couple times a day. Meanwhile, they missed math or reading or whatever it was that happened in class. Almost to a person, they're held back 1 or 2 years. Several of them are put in special education classes because they don't know their colors and they don't count to 100 in English, right? And so the idea is that bilingualism is good if your native language is English, but if your native language is not English, bilingualism is bad. So that's a very common myth that we're running up against, not only among teachers, but also among many people in the Hispanic community as well. What we find is a lot of sort of really well-meaning teachers, we talked about this earlier too, a lot of well-meaning teachers that work with heritage students, Generation 2 students, have this idea that and if you ever spent a lot of time around, let's see, how do I say this without completely stereotyping? But there's an idea in the community, especially among people of a certain age and from certain countries, that their job is to act as language police. This happens, I have friends here that do this in English too, right? Their job is to make sure that those errors don't get passed on, right? And so they're always correcting your grammar, and no one wants to hang out with them at the party because, yes, that was a preposition. It's because it's a Germanic language, just deal with it, okay, that sort of thing. What we find, though, is that a lot of times the kids are criticized for the way they speak. Not only in English, like your English isn't good enough, but they're criticized for the way their Spanish is. So either it doesn't match those norms, they say troca, and grandma comes from Mexico or from wherever and is like, oh, like, I don't understand you, stop speaking Spanglish, right? Or their teachers even will criticize and say, that's wrong, that's not how you say it like this. But grandma says it like that. And so what we find is that these kids, who are often English dominant by the time they hit 5th or 6th grade, just say, forget this. Like if I'm gonna get criticized all the time, I'll just speak English. And so we're also trying to change those myths. So talking about language diversity, it's the same sort of thing, right? So it's the same sort of thing with like an Appalachian English. I have a colleague that works at a small school in Appalachia, and she does writing workshops for local teachers. And the whole thing there is about, let's teach code switching, right? So you say this, but if you're gonna submit to this journal, you write it this way. But neither one is, Kim Patowski has a great metaphor. If you guys have heard the flip-flop versus high heel metaphor, right? So if you're gonna go to a wedding in a fancy church, flip-flops are not appropriate, right? And so what you want are high heels or whatever. But if you're gonna go hang out on the beach, then high heels are ridiculous and are not gonna get you anywhere. What you want is flip-flops. And so no one would ever say that high heels are superior to flip-flops. People might say flip-flops are superior to high heels. I don't have a lot of experience in this realm, but that's my understanding. But there's an appropriate context for each. And so the idea is that your vernacular language, right, your home dialect, is the flip-flop. And that's what helps you to interact with people in your own community and to have that sense of identity. The high heels is what you got to turn on for a job interview. And it's just, it would be great if you could change the perception that standard language is not better than other language. That's not going to happen. So what we need to do then is work at it from the back door, in my opinion, and then teach these speakers how to code switch and turn it on and off to maintain their identity, but also be able to get a job at some point.
Why is Spanglish a problematic term?
So Spanglish is a problematic term because it's such a loaded term. So no one really knows what it means. So the community uses it widely. The community will come right out and say, hablamos Spanish, right? We say, no problem saying that whatsoever. As a linguist, you're not really sure, does it refer to code switching? Does it refer to loanwords? Does it refer to different pronunciations? Does it refer to some of these calques or conceptual convergences like te llamo para atrás? It seems to be primarily a loanword code switching thing, but so instead I'm just going to say code switching, or I'm going to say loanwords to sort of specify that. And it's that idea of US Spanish is bad. This is by Spanish speakers outside the US and inside the US. US Spanish is bad because US Spanish is Spanglish. So Spanglish is bad, Spanglish is US Spanish is bad, therefore we shouldn't speak US Spanish anymore. And so that's why linguists try to avoid that term. That said, I think it's a losing battle. I mean, I think people are going to use it, and there are people that use it as, in a positive way and say, yeah, I speak Spanglish, so what? But as a linguist, we want to be much more specific on that.
Can I ask how you chose the loanwords?
So I really wish there were some sort of massive, we spent years of research digging up the most common loanwords. No, they were things that either we had heard in the community or that had appeared in previous studies. And the reason we chose the number that we did is because we needed it to fit on the survey that the undergrads were going to do in the community. They had to go out and do 10 of these. And so we could have easily chosen, some of those were going to go on no matter what. Wachale was going to go on that list. Aplicación was going to go on that list. But no, if we had chosen 10 different loanwords, we would have gotten different results. But I think similar patterning. There would have been some words that are just, it's just what it is, right? A word like high school, right? The problem there becomes how do you spell that on a survey, because everyone you ask is going to spell it. If you just spell it high school in English, you're going to say it's an English word, right? Because high school doesn't correspond with, so for example in Mexico, what we would call, usually in Spanish class here you learn that it's escuela secundaria, but escuela secundaria in Mexico is middle school. You'll hear colegio, in Mexico it's preparatoria. So some terms like high school become this neutral term where you no longer have to distinguish, wait, do you mean Mexican high school or do you mean Puerto Rican high school? No, we just mean high school, right? So it was just based on those previous studies and what we knew about stuff. We would love to do it again with different loanwords.